Yaglidu, everyone. This is Adam again. For the third part of this lecture on Dene or Athabascan cultures, I want to talk about some major themes in Athabascan storytelling, as well as social life and social structure here in Alaska, and especially as manifest in the reading that you did, which was Make Prayers to the Raven, a Koyukon view of the Northern Forest by Richard Nelson. Richard Nelson is this man right here who clearly just caught a very large fish. He lived in Huslia, Alaska, and wrote a book several decades ago that's become a very well-known ethnography called Make Prayers to the Raven. He spent time there, he did interviews, he learned about people's lives, basically what a cultural anthropologist does. This is the community he lived in, Huslia. So Koyukon is this specific Athabascan group right here, whose traditional homelands border that of the Gwich'in, the Inupiaq, and a tiny little bit of Yupik, Illichaushuk, Upper Kuskokwim, and Tanana. Now, I want you to think a little bit about what stood out to you from the Make Prayers to the Raven reading, and I want to draw on that reading and also some other things about Athabascan culture and draw out a few kind of themes, just a few different things of so many other things we could talk about to give you a bit of a flavor for interior Athabascan life, both traditionally and today. The first theme is the idea of a seasonal life. So I really liked this chart from the book. Um, where he's showing basically, depending on the month of the year, the different kinds of things people are doing, right? Caribou hunting over here in November and December and January, moose hunting in the end of August, bear hunting intermittently at different times, fur animal hunting and trapping, especially this time of year in the winter, waterfowl more in during migratory times that are bookending the summer. Um, Snowshoe hare hunting, obviously, more during certain times of years than others, river fishing when the salmon are running, and so on and so forth. So, and he's even got here, wage labor. So folks going out to other types of employment other than subsistence hunting or fishing, because this was written back in he was doing his work back in the 70s and 80s. So when you look at that, one of the things that I come across or that comes across to me so clearly is the degree to which traditional Athabascan life for Koyukon communities and for many other Dene communities too had a tremendous amount of movement and adaptability to it. People adapting and moving around their home territories to make use of different animal and plant beings that were ready to be used, ready to be hunted and gathered and fished. And so you would have stable home bases, territories for a community, but a lot of movement within them as people were finding, going out to hunt ptarmigans, going out to hunt snowshoe hares, going to another place to do river fishing for several months, going another place to do ice fishing on a lake, yet another place to go do berry picking, right? So a tremendous amount of movement. In the wake of colonialism, especially American presence in the mid-20th century, a lot of Koyukon Athabascan people sort of became more rooted primarily in one specific village, sometimes associated with a Christian mission or different things. However, as he describes in his reading, people were still moving around a ton, even if they had a home, like literally a home house, stationary house. Back in Hustia, people were sort of traveling out to different places all the time. So this traditional pattern of movement was still very much there. And I find that really interesting for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being that Athabascan languages are often extremely adaptable with their verbs, including movement verbs. So they're languages that can be incredibly precise about how things move in ways that you can do in English, but it's not as direct. Whereas in Athabascan languages, it's sort of built into the language itself. Highly, highly adaptable, highly complex, and a whole lot of motion and movement. And so it's kind of interesting not to imply some sort of, basic language determinism where language determines culture. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it is interesting how this sort of pattern of movement and motion then kind of is mirrored in the language. So I've got here several sort of screenshots from the reading. One, just to kind of give a bit of a flavor of this, you've already done the reading, so I won't belabor the point. But you've got spring, where among other things, transportation starts to be difficult as the snow melts and there's a huge water flooding for a little bit of time. So during the winter, obviously, people can get around traditionally with snowshoes and sledges, and more recently with snow machines. And during the summer, among other things, people can use watercraft or just, walk around depending on the location. But you have a certain short period of time where you have like a tremendous amount of flooding, right? And then it's hard to get anywhere. As he says, prudent villagers try to cut and haul a good supply of firewood before the snow softens to a quagmire. So you've got a bunch of muddy soil, and then you've also got these flooding conditions. But he talks about all sorts of different things. The subsistence years begins with spring, the living environment is renewed, a rush of warmth. He talks about the snowshoe hares are hunted by boys with rifles. Ptarmigan congregate in certain thickets, and so hunters go there to go find fresh meat in those specific patches of forest. Um, it's also when people go out to go beaver trapping. So, and then that they're traveling a lot, and because it's somewhat warmer now, people are going farther and farther. Sometimes people are making use of the fact that the black bears are just starting to emerge from their den and aren't as lively yet. All these different things that are going on. But then he says, the snow shrinks away quickly into the intense sunshine. Travel becomes difficult, then impossible. The river ice softens, lifts on the rising flood, and carries away in chaotic flows during the early part of May. Right. So spring is let's travel, 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 except for then it becomes very hard to travel. So all this different stuff going on. Willow buds burst with leaves, summer is upon the land. And then you move, by the way, that was a picture of a muskrat, which was one of the animals that was mentioned. And then in the summer, of course, fish being a huge theme, we tend to think of this with many Alaska Native groups, but there's other things going along as well. He does talk about the drying racks. And so I've got a couple of pictures here to illustrate that. If you've never seen kind of a classic Dene drying rack for salmon, here you go. Um, and used other places as well. So with split salmon, and sort of people processing salmon here. This is from the website Encounters North, where Richard Nelson has also produced some things. Anyways, he talks about families establish the new season by establishing camps along tributary streams where they set nets for pike and whitefish. And then he talks about going to, people find like specific forests that they go to that they like to find house logs, especially if they're building onto their house. He talks about some people go out to get wage employment, other places in Alaska. So even that, right, even the sort of going out to participate in the cash economy shows this sort of traditional movement-based lifestyle. Talk about people loading up on gear and heading for fish camp, and then making use of fish. How there's a chum king, and then finally silver salmon runs, and then gradually the fish camps vanish, and the racks are just standing there empty as people leave, and people start to cut wood. Sometimes they're hunting waterfowl. You move into the fall. He says it's the most important season for wild harvest. He says the willows are brilliant yellow, and hunters know that moose are entering the rut. So men, often accompanied by their wives, travel by boat to their favorite hunting areas. So people are going out this way and going out that way, going to go hunting. And then black bears are in peak condition and are sometimes taken too. Huge quarters of meat are hung in the smokehouses to age. The river begins to freeze. Gill nets are set beneath the ice in certain lakes. So I want you to kind of be thinking as we read these different things, not just, oh, this is interesting, but sort of how tremendous amount of traditional ecological knowledge you have to be aware of all these different moving pieces within your environment, when they're most available, what location they're likely to be most available, and therefore be able to plan this kind of strategy that is very, very complex, all things considered, right? What I'm describing with traditional Koyukon life is in some ways a lot more complicated than me going to the same college campus every single day and working roughly the same amount of time for work every single day, really throughout the year, although don't do the face-to-face teaching over the summer. But the point is a lot of us have jobs like that are quite predictable throughout the year. Or maybe we work like two jobs, right? For Koyukon people, it's very much kind of like they're doing like, 15 different jobs throughout the year that they've got to keep track of and know where they slot in. It's very, very interesting and complex. And then winter, he talks about hunting falls off, the recurrent spells of deep cold. Snares are set for snowshoe hares, grouse are hunted as they feed atop the tall willows. Here you go, cute birds. Flocks of ptarmigan are enthusiastically sought. Trappers shift their efforts to beaver and muskrat. So that is one theme that I thought you would find interesting, is this sort of like movement theme. Another theme that I wanted to talk about was this idea of distant time. And so within Koyukon traditional stories, there's a phrase "adont-ne," and forgive my poor Koyukon if we have any Koyukon speakers that heard me say that, but it translates into essentially like it happened in a distant time. It is said that this happened during distant time, but in colloquial, people just shorten that to like just distant time. So that's what Richard Nelson is calling it, distant time. And this time period where, as he quotes it, the animals were human, with the idea that humans, um, the animals we now know as animals, such as burbot, such as raven, there was a time period where they were very much human. And then over time, they became, some of them passed away and became animal people or became plant people. But that for that reason that they used to be human, that's one reason perhaps why they can continue to sort of have these complex thoughts and complex emotions, right? There's sort of these traces and legacies of their humanness. So non-human people, as an anthropologist would sometimes that's the way we like to translate that concept into English. This theme that I'm talking about there finds echoes in a lot of other Dene cultures across not just Alaska, but across North America, where there's often some much earlier time where animals were much more like humans, and occasionally where humans were much more like animals, and or a time period when humans and animals could transform back and forth more readily. But this time period, though, especially where humans and animals were much more similar, and that over time they've separated, right? So you have that thought process, that kind of way of thinking about the distant time long ago, even all the way down in Arizona, where I used to live with Dene, Navajo Nation, right? Not the same stories precisely, but kind of a similar way of thinking about the deep, deep, deep past. And you see some similarities with Denina as well down here in Cook Inlet. And so up there in Koyukon, right, this is sort of this idea of a long ago time when the relationships between humans and animals were much more intertwined. And in some Dene stories, the idea that some kind of tragedy happened where then there a kind of a chasm opened up between these animals, or in this case, maybe not so much a tragedy as just a, natural growing apart. Many times these stories are how certain natural features came to be, such as a constellation, forgot the word for that for a second, or a rock outcropping. Sometimes they're about how animals came to have certain traits. Sometimes they're about sort of the personalities that animals had when they were people, and with the thought being that those sort of carry into how the animals are now, and much more than that as well. He uses an example with lingcod or burbot, that when it was human, he decided to leave the land, become a water animal. He's quoting a Koyukon storyteller. So he started down the bank, taking a piece of bear fat. The other animal people wanted to stay and tried to hold him back, stretching him all out of shape in the process. This is why the burbot has such a long, stretched out body, and why its liver is rich and oily like the bear fat its ancestor carried to the water long ago. So this sort of direct way in which past events are reverberating into the present, right? The past is sort of never far behind in Athabascan storytelling, even if it is distant time and recognized as such. Those stories are within a Koyukon framework, a set of not just narratives, but something which embeds a series of ways of living, which it is felt helps people to live good lives, to live healthy lives. My grandfather said he told the stories, this is a quote from the reading, because they would bring the people good luck, keep them healthy, and make a good life. This idea of sort of proper ways of life and proper ways of thinking growing out into health, and that is a major focus of life. That is very much a reoccurring theme in Dene cultures, again, not just in Alaska, but across North America, again, all the way down into Navajo Nation Apache land. Very much kind of somewhat similar concepts and an intense focus on that idea. Another thing, which yet again holds true across much of North America and certainly here in Alaska, this is this concept that is often translated into English as taboo. Taboo actually comes from a variety of Polynesian and other Pacific Island languages. The word tapu is usually more what it was, and then it kind of became anglicized as taboo, and taboo then got adopted by anthropologists as kind of like anytime we encounter a culture where there's the idea that you shouldn't do a certain kind of like daily action, and that to do so would cause some kind of like negative effect, perhaps perhaps not always, but perhaps very often from a spiritual world, some kind of like prohibition backed up by the spiritual or that which is beyond the human. And so in this context, hutlane is the word for it, translated in English as taboo. And as he points out, people back in the 70s, they would often be saying this kind of thing, like, don't do that, it's taboo, such as, women weren't supposed to be scraping certain animal hides because that was taboo. Or he talks the fact that these taboos very often derive from in one way or another, the distant time stories. So oftentimes I have seen that people, when they hear about a list of prohibitions a culture might have, if that's all you're hearing, it sort of might just seem like a random list of like, okay, interesting. They don't eat these five animals, these other four animals they don't eat during the winter. Okay. Like it's like it doesn't seem cohesive. It doesn't seem like it fits together, but it does very much so, or at least a lot of it does, when you contextualize it in light of the distant time stories. It helps to explain where these come from, and it's part of a like kind of a web of thinking about animal human relationality, where thoughts lead to health and to action, where the past directly echoes into the present, where animals can feel disrespected by the actions of humans because they're sentient, right? There's all these sort of implicit ideas that undergird many, if not all, of these taboos. They're not just sort of random prohibitions, not at all. So he talks about one, how the suckerfish was a great thief in distant time, and so it's not well thought of. One man said that he could never bring himself to eat the fish, knowing what it had been and fearing that it would make a thief of him. So taboos in the sense that like everybody recognizes taboo, and then also sort of in the sense of certain things that maybe it's not strictly taboo, but people will tend not to do because of an associated with a distance time. In a reading that I used to require in this class, no longer do, but it's very good, and I put it as an optional reading in the folder, Dead Ganag scholar Beth Gondadoy Leonard says, Koyukon belief stresses that in the distant past there was a time in Leonard, sorry, I mispronounced her name. Koyukon belief stresses that in the distant past there was a time in the transition world where transformation of creatures was possible and all had transhuman aspects. So bear, wolf, wolverine, and lynx had two souls like contemporary man, and they could change from one form to another. After the Great Flood, man and other forms of nature underwent change. Man became Dene, or human, with other forms of nature taking on their distinctive features as we know them now. By the way, this notion of the Great Flood, it probably won't surprise you. Um, A, that Christianity is that many Koyukon people are Christian, and B, that many Christian Koyukon people have noted, right, the similarity between their Great Flood traditional story and the flood narrative in the Abrahamic traditions, including in the Bible, and it overtly make that parallel. There's a great video about it called that actually is related to this book. I'm pretty sure Richard Nelson was the one that did the film series, but or at least helped with it. But it was Make Prayers to Raven, and then it was something like Flood Stories is the subtitle or something like that. It's very, very good. So check it out. It's on YouTube. A good example of one of these distant time stories is Nifokov Nidashin, or The Man and Wife as Told by Bell Deacon. And so I'm not going to tell you the whole thing, although if you ever want to check it out, you can find it on, again, that optional reading that I put into the PowerPoint. But among other things, what happened is that there's a man who loves the ice cream that his wife makes, and they're located at like the head of a river, and she's always making ice cream for him, like while he's out doing different things. And then one day she disappears, and he doesn't know where she is for a long time. And then Raven comes by in the winter, and he's like, I'm actually not sure it was the winter, but the point is, Raven comes by a few months later, and he's basically like, your wife's not dead like you think, right? She's just like taken by like a giant, and she's at the bottom of a lake. And so Raven then takes a piece of wood and he crafts it into the shape of a pike. He has the man go and grab certain stones and put them into the piece of wood, which then become the pike's eyes. And the man is then able to enter into the pike, and he and Raven go and are able to rescue his wife. And so here, oh, and by the way, and then that becomes kind of an origin of pike, right? From this sort of thing that Raven did with this piece of wood. And there's some etymological things going on here too, where the tree that's being mentioned, the spruce and the pike, have like some similar linguistic things going on in terms of how they sound. But in any case, when you look at a story like that, we always say that Raven is a trickster. That's most people know that. But in a story like that, that doesn't really quite seem right of what he's doing. Here he's almost more of like a helper and creator and very benevolent, right? And it depends on the story. How's Raven's acting in the story? Here he's actually referred to as a grandfather. And in Koyukon stories, Raven is involved in sometimes, depending on the story, in fashioning humans to begin with. Richard Nelson calls him an omnipotent clown, benevolent mischief maker, buffoon, and deity, which is an interesting way of translating it. So, very fascinating example. All right, third theme. I talked about storytelling. or sorry, I talked about, this sort of movement and like movement with the seasons and adaptability and motion and different activities, different times of the years and complexity, right? I talked about that with subsistence, the seasonal cycle. We talked about storytelling and this idea of sort of a time when humans and animals were very much like each other and a distance that's happened over time. And now I'm going to talk about a third theme that doesn't come out a ton in the reading I had you do, but which is also a common theme in Athabascan life. So I want to bring it up. It's really, really hugely important for understanding Dene or Athabascan life, which is the true centrality, pivotal relationship of relationships, right? That is at the very heart of understanding Dene culture. So things are not static, things are they, they move and there's motion, and there's also just a lot of sort of dynamic like thing. Life is about relationships, right? These interactions between people, not just a solitary being, which, admittedly, um, virtually all cultures recognize that relationships are important. You probably noticed there's not a whole lot of cultures where everybody's a hermit. That culture would cease to exist after one generation. So all cultures recognize relationships as important, but they put different kinds of emphases on different kinds of relationships. In Athabascan cultures, generally, family relationships are hugely important, including clans. So I want to talk a little bit about clans. This is a traditional Gwich'in village schematic that is from an ethnography of Gwich'in, originally from Slobodin's work. And you see here basically references to upper, middle, and lower clans that are gathered around a main fireplace. So you have a bunch of people, among other things you should know with the C's, the A's, and the B's, you essentially have close clan relatives living near each other, and then people within the village separating out into different areas depending on clan. So it's not that one village equals one clan, and people may be from multiple clans in a single village, although very often a single village may tend to have more of a certain clan, and that clan may kind of be somewhat dominant in that area. So within life, traditionally, you had these small groups. It could be very, very small, such as like two families that are living near each other or a three-generation of family. But then oftentimes people would sort of group up into these larger bands of 10 to upward, even like 50 families sometimes living together for a time, for a purpose, such as hunting together, trading together. That's especially where groups could get very big, doing ceremonies together, doing fish camp together. And so um, and, among other things, you had within this life three matrilineal exogamous clans, as well as wealth ranks and age grades. Let me explain. That's a lot of anthro terms all at once, because anthropologists, right? Why say something simple if you could say it complicated? Helps you sell more books. Just kidding. So matrilineal means your descent is primarily traced through your mom's line. One could argue that American culture is a mix of many, many cultures. So let me be really clear on what I mean. One could argue that many of the Western European cultures that heavily influenced early America have had kind of loose patrilineality, which is why for a very long time it's only started to sort of become less so more recently. But for a very, very long time, it was almost universal that women upon marriage would take the last name of their husband and that the children would take on the last name of that man's family. So it's patrilineal descent through the father's lines. So if you go back far enough, it keeps going up through different fathers, right? This is the opposite. This is matrilineal, where your clan identity is given to you by your mother. Cultures that are matrilineal, there's a lot of things to note about them that tend to be common themes. One thing to note is that it doesn't necessarily mean matriarchal. It doesn't necessarily mean that like women are the leaders of the communities in a political sense. And indeed, Dene leaders very often were men, although women also often held very prominent, important roles. And so there's kind of this sense sometimes in anthropology when you look at a lot of matrilineal cultures that it doesn't necessarily mean a matriarchy or a woman-controlled society, but that it does tend to be less of a like a really strong patriarchy, if that makes sense. So more of a complex or perhaps more egalitarian relationship. So matrilineal clans where your line is through your mom, and then they're exogamous, and so meaning that you marry outside of your clan when you want to get married. And so those are important. There's also a notion of it being important to be able to control one's own sexual desires and actions. There was also historically in Gwich'in life, it was not unheard of. It wasn't super common either, but it wasn't unheard of to have both polyandry and polygyny, meaning having multiple husbands or having multiple wives, particularly if one was sort of prominent within the community, right? All right. By the way, so that was all like examples of kind of which in clan life. Atna, the group Atna Athabascan have some kind of similar things, kind of different, but clans are still super important. Here, what you have traditionally in Atna society, there are 8 to 10 different clans. You're like, why does it say 8 to 10? Why don't we know the exact number? Knowing exact numbers of clans can be complicated with Athabascan groups or any Alaska Native groups sometimes. Well, at least with Athabascan, some of the Athabascan groups for a variety of different reasons that I'm not going to have enough time to super get into now. But one of them is that in modern times, certain clans may have less people than they used to, or not have many people that claim that line, but we know that that clan once existed from early historical writings. But in the early historical writings or the early anthropological writings, like things from the 1800s, they often didn't know exactly how to write native words. And so a lot of times it's confusing which clan they're talking about and how to like correlate that to modern groups. So it's more complicated than that, but basically that's kind of the gist of it, or part of it. So 8 to 10 clans that are then divided into two moieties. If you're not familiar with the term moiety, the idea is that it's where society is divided into two halves, and they're also exogamous. So you need to marry outside of your clan, but you also need to marry outside of your moiety, which would be implied. Your moiety, again, is sort of like a group of clans that are on one side and a group of clans that are on the other. So there's Raven half of society and there's Seagull half of society, traditionally within Atna life. And you, different clans belong to Raven and different clans belong to Seagull. But again, matrilineal clans once again here. And so matrilineal clans is this reoccurring theme over and over and over again in many Dene or Athabascan cultures. And that doesn't mean that people don't also obviously know about their paternal or father ancestry, by no means. And of course, those relatives may be very important to people. But there's sort of this strong emphasis on sort of matrilineal clans as kind of your first group identity and a really powerful group identity. And you can see how that sort of naturally places more emphasis on women than some societies do, right? To have matrilineality in that way. It also places more emphasis on your maternal uncle, so your mom's brothers. So many matrilineal societies, such as Atna, here in Alaska, are avunculocal, meaning that married couples would often go to live near the husband's mom's dad when they got married. Or I suppose it could also be the wife's maternal uncle as well, but it was very commonly it was the husband's maternal uncle. Either way, this tendency to go and live with the maternal uncle of one of the two partners was quite common, which makes sense, right? You're going to go and live near other people from your clan. People from your clan are sort of naturally on your team. They may be closely related to you, they may be rather distantly related to you, but you're still related through the same matrilines at some point back. And so you're sort of on the same team. And historically, people kind of thought of themselves that way, right? This is a list, by the way, of sort of the different Atna clans that are known from the from literature and from more recent reasons. A final fourth theme that I wanted to bring up about Athabascan life is the idea of what I'm calling informal consensus-based leadership. And what I mean by that is Athabascan Dene communities in Alaska tended to have, I say tended, but you see a lot of reverberations of this today, of course, but historically, the pattern was very much to have leaders of different communities, but that the leadership was often not inherited, or if it was passed down, it was only passed down like a single generation. And it's because like, the dad and the son were both really solid leaders because the reason why leadership generally wasn't like a inherited generation after generation thing is because it wasn't really based on you're the monarch because your line has always been the monarch or something like that. No, these are much more local scale leaders who have far less power than like a monarch or something. And people, if they don't like those leaders, they can just choose to get a new leader or choose to leave and go to another place, right? If they're not liking how that leader's acting. So generally, these leaders are supported in a sense, very direct democratic sense by the people, right? In a very real sense, the people are choosing to buy into this guy as our leader, such as in this case, Chief Isaac, who was a Han Athabascan man. Here he's ice fishing in 1898. The leaders were very much leaders by the consent of their people, right? Democracy, we sometimes think of it as something that was sort of birthed around the time of the American Revolution, or maybe birthed in ancient Greece in a different form. But in reality, sort of these democratic movements or democratic ways of choosing leaders have been around for very, very long times in various different places, although they've looked very different from each other. And this is a really good example, is traditional Athabascan leadership. And so in this case, leaders tended to be recognized or people tended to recognize somebody as a leader and follow them if they were somebody that was really energetic, hardworking, resourceful. They were good with trading. They tended to have good luck. And really importantly, they were generous and they showed that they were truly concerned about the welfare of the people in their community. So kind of all the things you would want in a leader. So I kind of like this approach. I like this approach of you're a leader until we don't want you to be a leader anymore. And the way you get to be a leader is you basically have to prove that you're very, very hardworking, very, very generous, and very, very much looking out for your community. All right, so to review, number one, motion and seasonal cycle of subsistence life. Number two, a long ago stories where animals and humans were much closer together or were together. Number three, matrilineal clans as a really important part of life. And number four, this sort of consensus chosen leaders. And that is what I wanted to say about common themes in Athabascan or Dene life, especially drawing on the Make Prayers to Raven, although at this point we've wandered rather far from that book. So, Tanan, thank you for your time.